A few things to tie up before we return to the desert. Let's get started.
Another race for the world's greatest driver, Juan Manuel Fangio.
Former world champion Jim Clark leapt into the lead. That's Clark's Lotus going like a bomb.
And James Hunt is the world champion by just one single point.
By being a racing driver, you are under risk all the time. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver.
And that is Michael Schumacher ahead, the world champion.
To become a four-time world champion, Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton, champion of the world.
That's for all the kids out there who dream the impossible.
Max Verstappen is champion of the world.
Oh my God! Max Verstappen, you are the world champion! The world champion!
Hello and welcome to episode 31 of F1 in Review 2023. I'm Tom Clabon and as ever I'm joined by Tristan Fancourt and Angus Gallager. So kicking us off to start with, we've got the US-based Andretti team. They've had a bid to enter Formula 1 with the General Motors Cadillac brand that's been approved by the FIA. Now Andretti Formula Racing were the only team approved by the FIA out of 4 possible candidates, but they'll only be admitted if they deem to add value to the championship as a whole. This will be the next thing that's assessed in the next stage of the process. So our thoughts then on another team potentially joining Formula 1.
I think it'll add value. And you don't have to go far back in time when we used to have more than 20 cars on the grid. And so to me, it seems really normal to have more than 10 teams, to have 22, 24 cars racing around a circuit. But for anyone who joined very recently, this will be a bit of a debacle. And if you had your ear to the ground, you'll know that basically the 10 teams in F1 don't want to give up their slice of the pie because they've had it pretty good ever since sort of 2016, 2017, when the people like Mauritius fell out of the sport. They've had more of the winnings to themselves. And so they've been left basically living the good times where Formula One's been growing in popularity. And as a result, they've been keeping more of the prize money. And now another team, and in the form of Andretti this time, but it could be other teams in the future, are saying, hey, we want a little bit of that. The people like Ferrari, Mercedes, Haas, they're thinking, no way, I want to give up this. But from my perspective, this is really good. Andretti, I think, would be a bit of a wildcard option and would give opportunities for new drivers to get in to the sport, because teams like Haas at the moment are turning away younger talent and going for older, steadier drives, which means there are 2 seats that are going to individuals that have already been in Formula 1. And what I would say is, if we hadn't have had more teams on the grid, individuals like Carlos Sainz, like Esteban Ocon, wouldn't have actually had their drives in the first place, because it was only through teams like Toro Rosso, through Mauritius, and then if you go back even further than that, with teams like Lotus and Caterham being on the grid as well, we would have had drivers of different calibers, but drivers like Romain Grosjean and stuff being on the grid either. So to me, it's a simple choice. It's get more teams on the grid, get more drivers on the grid, get more sponsorship, improve engagement equals more good.
I'm in agreement. I think that the more teams on the grid, to a certain extent, the better. Like you say, it's those little teams which give the drivers their big break. You see the odd example with, like, obviously Oscar Piastri this year at McLaren, and maybe someone like Max Verstappen at Toro Rosso a few years back, and also that Toro Rosso AlphaTauri team has given lots of youngsters a chance. But the simple fact of the matter is, unless a youngster has money, they're not going to get as much chance to get on the grid. And smaller teams who are prepared to take a punt on these drivers, they're the reason why some of these talents are discovered. Fernando Alonso started at Minardi, which was what Toro Rosso used to be called, and they were like the 11th fastest team. They gave a young Spanish rookie a chance, and he proved to be absolute gold dust. Kimi Räikkönen started at BMW Sauber back in the 2000s. If it wasn't for them taking a chance on him, again, we would never have seen Raikkonen in the sport. I think there has to be a limit. I think that 2 more teams would be fair. I remember the days, the early 2010s, where, like you said, we had Mana Marussia, Caterham, and remember HRT?
Yeah,
no,
HRT,
not hormone
yeah.
replacement therapy, but Hispania Racing Team. That's 24 cars on the grid, and admittedly, those 3 teams were ghastly slow, and they couldn't really keep up in the development race. But we had more cars on the grid, and it was interesting, and drivers got their break. I mean, Jules Bianchi, remember him? He started at Mana Marussia and would have progressed up the grid were it not for his fatal accident at Suzuka. Like Daniel Ricciardo started at HRT. You know, Toro Rosso wants to put him in F1, give him a drive, and he started there and then progressed up the ranks to become a multiple Grand Prix winner. I think this application being met is very good news for Formula One. It gives extra 2 seats on the grid. It means that there'll be less chance of an argument over whether someone like Liam Lawson should have to wait for a seat on the grid. We can just stick him in the 11th team. And if it means anything else, it means that if Max Verstappen ever has to win from the back of the grid, he at least has 4 more cars to overtake. So it makes it a bit more difficult for him, thankfully.
I'm a bit more sceptical about this, if I'm honest, because I think back to the days of Formula One having more than 10 teams, and I think, well, if it was so great, why isn't that the case now? Why did teams leave? And I think, well, the opportunity, and in theory it sounds very good to have more teams on the grid. I think in reality it presents more opportunities which look alive and kicking and well, but are often dead. And you often have teams having to rely more on paid drivers and drivers who, more often than not, really don't have the calibre to be in Formula One. Vitaly Petrov being a good example of that one. Bruno Senna, another example of a driver that wouldn't have got into Formula One through the current system in terms of there being 10 teams that was given it, because there was a wider, let's say, more bloated Formula One system. That being said, I do think it's very important that if teams are to join, they should be vetted as they are, but indeed add value. And I think that the like of Audi coming in, Andretti as well, as we hear in this story, potentially coming to Formula One is very much a good thing. But to use a more sort of sceptical historical example, we've seen many a different car manufacturer come into the team, or come into the sport rather, and leave. Toyota, BMW being examples of that, the various iterations of Lotus as well. So I welcome it in principle, but I think I'm perhaps a bit scarred is the wrong word, but haunted by the more recent iterations of more teams equals more racing equals good. I think if we're going to go and have that opinion when it comes to races and the calendar, you also need to go and bear that in mind, I think, when it comes to drivers and teams, personally.
I think there's been some changes since we saw the catastrophic collapse of Lotus, for example, and how they got bankrupt and fell out of the sport. Teams like Caterham as well just didn't have enough money, fell out as well. And it's not a cheap sport. We must remind ourselves it's not a cheap sport. Andretti's entrant bid is, well, it's supposed to be $200 million, but there have been discussions, haven't there, about whether or not he'll pay more than that. Teams want more than that for him to enter, and it may well settle around the 400 million mark. We'll wait and see. But the reason I think we're getting more interest in the sport is because of the reforms that have been made to the way that the prize money is dealt, and also the way that teams can spend, that makes it more appealing. In fact, whilst Haas have made many mistakes in the sport, they did one thing absolutely right, and they timed their entrance into F1 perfectly. Because when they joined the sport and debuted in 2015, F1 was pretty cheap. It was pretty cheap to enter. It was unpopular in 2015, and it's weird to think that now, because that was 8 years ago. And you think, wow, a lot changed 8 years. But F1 was kind of unpopular. It was falling in standings. People weren't really watching it. Peak Mercedes dominance as well, and little would we know about the 2016 excitement, Rosberg versus Hamilton. But 2015, kind of bit of a meh period for Formula One. And Haas join, it's kind of cheap, and then the other team sort of fall out and leaves you with 10. And ever since then, ever since sort of 2016, things have been picking up a little bit, and it's becoming more and more popular for the teams. And so Haas has gone in low and is now, if you think about it, worth an absolute fortune because of what they represent. They represent a place on the grid that's worth, at least, according to Andretti, 200 million, and it's going to be more than that. Let's face it, because they've got all the facilities behind them and they've got that golden ticket onto the grid. So I disagree, Tom. I think if you go back, 10 years, you're absolutely right. Formula One is only giving money to basically Ferrari and the other mainstay teams that have been there for donkey's years. I mean, Ferrari is still paid a certain amount of money just because they've existed a long time. But what I'd say now is growing popularity, budget caps, good prize money at the end of it, and excellent status means that Formula One is quite an appealing thing for companies that have a lot of money to spend on whatever they want. And I'm personally quite pleased that we've got a potential new manufacturing with Cadillac as well. Okay, I don't particularly think much of their cars, but I think it could only be a good thing that we expand out, and the US market's a big one. We don't want to ignore it. So I think that we are in a new era of Formula One, perhaps. And I agree, Angus, that I want another team on top of Andretti. I would like it to be back to 24, if only because then that means I can pretend that I'm 8 years old again.
Huh. In terms of going up to 12 teams, what else can we say? Because one other bit in the news, obviously Andretti's had their application accepted. We've got this Rodin Cars team. I don't know if you've read about this, but the team which was going to have supply of cars from New Zealand, which in a calendar where it only goes down under once a year, I'm a little bit sceptical about that personally. And also they plan to reserve one of its 2 race seats for a female driver, which I think is a fantastic initiative. And their application was rejected. Thoughts on that? I think the fact it had a New Zealand base probably worked against it, right?
I think as well the big brands are always going to come in and always going to go and, I suppose, show their credibility and show why it's worthwhile to have them in. I think you look at teams like Haas, for example, and the various other ones which aren't bolstered by manufacturers per se, and I think they're more the anomaly to the rule than the rule itself. I think that perhaps they got lucky, but when it comes to the standard situation, I think it is car manufacturers win out because, as you say, it's a very lucrative market at this point. There is also the concern as well about can a team continue to go and operate within its own finances, i.e. make profits and be able to do well, or lose money indeed and be able to carry on, because we see 2 different teams in Alpine making profits, more recently Aston Martin not making profits. So it shows that it doesn't matter necessarily where you are in the grid and the table at the moment. You can often have a roller coaster, shall we say, of a financial history, or indeed a short-term sort of half and then some, really, when it comes to a season. So maybe finances were to play with it as well, I'd say.
I'm not sure why they were rejected. My suspicion is they're not founded, they don't have really enough foundation, perhaps, in motorsport. So Rodin itself is quite an interesting company because they actually specialise in these sort of lightweight F0 cars. They look kind of like Formula One cars already. But they've partnered with Carlin and Carlin Racing, which you may be familiar with if you look at Formula 2, for example. And so Rodin is partnering with Carlin for Formula 2. And that's their new partnership. And I imagine that they're looking at what they're doing in Formula 2 and thinking, well, let's step up to Formula 1. So I think perhaps it's actually one to watch in the future, because if they continue to partner with Carlin, bear in mind that Carlin itself is a Red Bull junior team, hence why it's got the Red Bull livery on when they're driving around at the moment. So there are these sort of tentacle networks into Formula One through their new partnership. So I could imagine them doing quite well at the moment in Formula 2 and Formula 4, and then proceeding to look at Formula 1 in a few years' time. So, at the end of the day, IndyCar as well, I would expect there may be some interest from IndyCar teams into Formula 1 in the future. So I don't know where they will come from, but I think it was certainly an interesting bid at the very least from Rodin. I just wonder whether or not they were rejected on the grounds that they weren't ready yet. They hadn't proved themselves enough yet. Let's not forget that Andretti has quite a lot of ties with the FIA already.
Would we be in favour then if there is another team or there's two more teams? Do we think then that the point scale, if you will, should drop down to P12, P14 to accommodate more teams, or maybe not?
It's an interesting debate. In IndyCar, they have a system where they have points down to every position. So even if you finish like 25th and you've retired from the race, then you still get 2 points or something like that, or 5 points. Now the counter to that is that the winner gets 50, and I think the second place gets 40. So you get a lot more points from it. And if we adopted that, it would shatter the points records in Formula One. But it's an interesting point. At the same time, if you give that option there, you take away the will of, for example, being down in 12th, 13th place and wanting to get that last point, because then you think, well, I'm going to get 11 points anyway for finishing 12th, so you might as well not push for it. What do you think, Tristan?
I think that it would be a good idea to expand the point system. I don't necessarily think we have to have points all the way down. And yeah, Angus, I agree that you need to have a cut-off so that you get that sort of desperate lunges for the significant point, the 1 point that will push your team forward. But I don't think we should have a scenario where at the end of the year, when like 4 teams all have no points. Sometimes in Formula One at the moment, you might have a season where 2 teams have no points. But I feel like if you got 4, it starts looking a little bit weird. So I would expect a review of the point system. I think we're due a review of the point system anyway, because I think there are some odd things at the moment, like fastest lap can only go to a team that's already in the points, which means that there's no like other strategy advantages down the field. So for example, if you're last, you've saved some tires and you're last, you stick them on and you try to get that fastest point. Or perhaps you're in 11th place and you've just about got a pit stop between you and the person behind, and you put on some new tires and you go for the fastest lap. I feel like at the moment we sort of neuter these unusual scenarios where 1 point can come out of nowhere, simply because we put these artificial limitations on who can actually access the bonus points. We have, as I say, I think we need a little bit of a review at the moment. And I would expect, therefore, that perhaps if we had 2 more teams, points would go down to 12th place rather than 10.
Yeah. I do think that's inherent. If you're going to go and have 12 teams, you can't just have the old system. It's like, to use an analogy of saying, these pair of trousers fitted you when you were 12, so you're 15 now, well, you just carry on as you are. And as well, when it comes to not only points, but points means prize money as well. If you're not going to go and give more opportunities for teams who've just joined to get more prize money, indeed the ones in the sport that's now bigger because it's generating more, because more people, more constructors are in it, then you're going to see the same old problem, I feel, of the early 2010s, where you're going to have 2 teams, maybe even 3 at the back, that have no chance in hell of getting to P10 or P9. They then crash out the sport because they're just not getting any prize money, and they are solely about because of the money that's being invested into them. You need to have a sustainable model, I feel, for Formula One. We say it's so expensive, so often, I suppose, the situation needs to go and fit what's happening, really. So I think you can't have one without the other, would be my sort of thought.
Putting them down 2 more places is an interesting point. Do you remember the time when Bernie Ecclestone, remember him, suggested that the point system should be changed so that it would be the driver with the most wins would win the championship, and that would be it, and they wouldn't decide any other positions. It would just be the driver with the most wins would be the winner, and then they'd have a count back for, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, etc. I thought that was an awful idea when it was suggested, but
Bernie Ecclestone, I wouldn't say was the best custodian of Formula One, especially towards the end. He had bonkers ideas. Do you remember when they brought in that rule that drivers weren't allowed to be given information from the teams And so you would have, someone radioing and be like, oh, there's a problem with the car. And then the team would go, yeah, there is. And they wouldn't be able to give them the settings to sort of change it and things like that. And of course, they rolled back on all that now. There were loads of those weird moments under Bernie Ecclestone where they just did things for no reason or for some half-baked notion about how it was better during the 1960s when, people drove round at 150 miles an hour and burnt to death like proper men.
Or the rule when they're only allowed one helmet change a season. Why?
Yeah.
Oh, ridiculous. Yeah. So moving on then to our second topic, AlphaTauri. We touched on this a bit last episode. Spoiler alert when it comes to their driver lineup for next season. Liam Lawson will not be in it as one of the permanent drivers. That'll be Yuki Tsunoda and Daniel Ricciardo. Our thoughts on this then? We touched on this, but what do we think about Daniel Ricciardo retaining the AlphaTauri seat along with Tsunoda and Liam Lawson not getting a sniff?
Boo. Boo. Don't like it. I've been vouching for Lawson ever since he stepped foot in that F1 car, and all that time ago, 5 weeks ago it was. Life can change a lot, but no, I think that he's done more than enough. Like he's come in. It's not the same as when Nick de Vries came in for that one-off race last year. Had a, let's be honest, with hindsight, favourable set of circumstances, aka engine penalties, and which bumped him up the grid. And then Williams, which was a rocket ship in a straight line around the circuit with the longest straights on the calendar. Now, what you have now is you have a driver who is in a, let's be honest, the AlphaTauri is a pretty woeful car overall. It's last in the Constructors' Championship. It's been on an upward trend, but it's pretty rubbish. And yet, he is getting the absolute most out of the car, not in one race, not two, but 4 races on the spin. He's measured up favourably to his teammate who has been in the AlphaTauri team for 3 years, or coming up to 3 years now, is Yuki Tsunoda. And in a team where they are known for promoting young... we're saying earlier on about young talent and teams giving young talent a chance. This team, which has done that over the years, is now saying, right, I want to retain a 34-year-old Grand Prix winner, admittedly, who might be past his best, and not focus on the future and think about what the future might be, not just for AlphaTauri or whatever they get renamed to if they get bought out, as is rumoured, but to Red Bull as well. Like Daniel Ricciardo, I'm sorry, for all those who dream about it, I'm going to crush your dreams. He is not the future of Red Bull. He's not. Simply is not. He's 34 years old. Like, Liam Lawson is... How old is Liam Lawson? 21 years old. He's born February 2002. He's 21 years old. He has experience in F2, in German touring cars. He has... And Super Formula as well. He has talent, he has experience, he wins on his debut in different series other than Formula 1. But, which is a bit harsh, admittedly. But he's proven more than enough, I'd say, to show that he's set fair for that seat. And why not give him a go next year? Let him prove his worth, to be honest.
Do you see any of the original, raw, young prodigy-esque sort of talent in Liam as we've come to now reflect on Max Verstappen back when Verstappen joined in 2016?
I'd say no.
Or is it not that level?
I'd say no. This is not me backtracking because I still believe he's a very good driver. Verstappen was different because you have to remember he was 17 when he started. Like, when you see a 17-year-old do what he did, you're just like, whoa, this guy is like precocious. He's either sports stars in all sports who are at a high level at a young age. They either go on to be stupidly good and an all-time great, or they fall off a cliff because they have too much pressure at too young an age, or they end up having too much excess because they get that fame and money really early in their lives, like way earlier than even the age that we are. Make us sound old there. But
I thought you made it sound like we have fame. There,
I'll do it. Would you say what?
Massively overblown.
Depends. You have to check our TikTok followers. Do follow us on TikTok, everyone. But in terms of
what a plug.
But in terms of Lawson, I'd say it's not the same level because he's young, sure, but like you get drivers coming to F1 at really young ages these days. Like Leclerc was like 20, Norris was still a teenager, Lance Stroll was still a teenager, Logan Sargent's like 21 or something like that. Tsunoda was very young, only like 20 or 19 or something like that when he started. So I don't think it's unusual for drivers to come in at that age and perform. Not that I'd say Lawson isn't doing a good job. Like I said, I think he's doing great, but Verstappen was different, you know. He drove in an F1 practice session before he turned 17. Like, that's different gravy.
Mm-hmm. I do wonder when it comes to Lawson, what could he have possibly done to get that seat for next season? Because I do think that AlphaTauri, Red Bull have been ideological when it comes to this decision to put Daniel Ricciardo in that seat. It's almost like they realised that Nick de Vries wasn't going to make it, and that was fine. Don't worry, Ricciardo's here to go and mop up all the pieces, and nobody's going to go and spoil that. Oh, he's pretty good. Anyway, we'll go Ricciardo anyway. That's how it kind of felt to me. It's like they didn't really factor in what was going on and had already made their decision from the moment that Ricciardo had sat down in that AlphaTauri seat. So it's a real shame. Like, if he'd have won a race, I'm not even convinced he'd have been given a sniff then, which is remarkable, really. But I think that Red Bull have been so well known for their hard-headed decision-making, but I don't think this decision is the correct one. So perhaps they've been a bit too proud, I'd argue, in terms of what they've done here.
Could just be that they don't want to rock the boat. I think that what we saw in silly seasons gone by, when, for example, Daniel Kvyat was removed for Max Verstappen, and then they swapped seats. Things like that was built upon the fact that Red Bull kind of just wanted to move forward, and now they are king of the hill. Why would you start digging, holes in your garden and start undermining yourself? And so, what they've got in Daniel Ricciardo and Yuki Tsunoda, I think they see as a known quantity. What we've accidentally discovered, simply because Ricciardo brought it upon himself, was a diamond in the rough and a new talent that none of us were talking about at the beginning. And so we're a little bit stuck now, and the Red Bull itself is going to be now stuck between a rock and a hard place. Because do they get rid of Yuki Tsunoda for Liam Lawson, but in removing Yuki Tsunoda, they lose a driver they've been developing for the last few years, who is, let's not forget, a good talent. Also comes with it the entry into the Asia region of the world, also very good for sponsorship and things like that. Or do they get rid of someone like Daniel Ricciardo that has been a Red Bull faithful, an old hand perhaps in the Red Bull era, and knows the team, another sort of known quantity, and also has ties himself to his sponsors and also into the South region and Australia. And whereas Liam Lawson kind of, where does he fit into that? What do they do? So do they rock the boat and get rid of those known quantities with Liam or not? But if I was Liam, I'd be looking at Williams because I think they're going to have an eye on him as well, and maybe he could get a 1 year from there. But it is a bit boring, isn't it? That's what my takeaway is. Red Bulls basically don't want to rock the boat, and so they're being boring. They've done the boring choice, and I commend them for playing the safe hand. But come on, it's not the Red Bull that we know, is it?
No, not at all. And again, we're left asking that question of what is AlphaTauri, because they seem to be a hybrid of a academy, if you will, on Formula One, or in Formula One rather, but then also a waiting room for that second seat, be that Yuki Tsunoda and or Daniel Ricciardo is going to go and take that. But it does feel, if there's any consolation to Liam Lawson, it feels, and this may be nothing, but it does feel like he's taking a break from Formula One, but will return, not too dissimilar to how things panned out for Esteban Ocon, dare I say, versus someone like Nick de Vries and perhaps Mick Schumacher, where it felt like there have to be some real changes. People making decisions that they didn't want to, or having to go and tear up plans and go again to get them into Formula One immediately or in years to come. Do you feel that as well? Does it feel like Liam Lawson will be back? We've heard some nice mood music, but does it go further than that, do you think?
I think it's ridiculous that you'd make a decent talent wait a year, because there's always that problem of, are they going to forget and or come back and be injured or something like that? there are always risks, especially when you have a driver that's active in other areas. And I just have this horrible feeling. Like, don't let another Kubica happen. And I know Kubica is slightly different because he injured himself outside the sport, but it doesn't matter. And a year is too late. Tomorrow is too late. If you want to do something, do it now. Just do it today before you forget or something gets in the way. And I would hate to think that we missed an opportunity. I mean, what would have happened if in 2016 Red Bull had passed up that opportunity to put Verstappen in Barcelona into that Red Bull? And then that would have been they lost a win. And what a win it was. A magnificent, unexpected win on a season that was completely dominated by Mercedes. It's always about doing things today. And I think if they leave it another year, it's going to be too late. And something's going to change and we won't be living that magic that we are at the moment. And I feel like that's what an extra team or extra two teams in Formula One, to link it all the way back, would mean is we can get these extra drivers in, because I feel like at the moment it's a bit silly. To answer your question, Tom, about what is AlphaTauri at the moment, I think what happened was basically Red Bull were using AlphaTauri because they've got no one else, or nowhere else to chuck him, nowhere else to chuck Ricciardo, and so they thought, I'll tell you what, chuck out De Vries. There's no one else waiting in the wings. Put him there for a year, and then we'll see what happens with Perez. And if Perez keeps performing poorly, we'll put Ricciardo back into the Red Bull. We'll have our Max Verstappen Ricciardo duo. Good times gone past. But of course, Ricciardo has thrown a spanner in the works by breaking his wrist and allowing Liam to take the spotlight away from him. So that's, I think, why AlphaTauri ended into this weird position. But I would say, ironically, of course, through getting rid of Nick De Vries, through bringing Ricciardo in, and Ricciardo breaking his wrist, AlphaTauri has now done what it's supposed to do. It's demonstrated a young talent, and Red Bull are like, oh, oops, we accidentally discovered someone new. Oh well, off you go for a year.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how it transpires, because we might be in danger of saying that in F1 people forget things pretty quickly, and someone like Oscar Piastri was lucky because he won the F2 championship and then he managed to stick around and be in a reserve role for a year and then got his drive, and obviously he's proven he's going to be, I reckon, top class. Lawson needs to do the same. He needs to be in that paddock next year. He needs to effectively lock himself in that paddock and be there all the time and be around Red Bull, be around AlphaTauri, soak up as much information as possible, because it doesn't look likely he's going to get a seat. Williams looks like it's going to close that door, whether it's Logan Sargent or Mick Schumacher going through the door instead. I think that he needs to be around and just make himself known, make his presence there so that people remember him and remember his name, so that he can then have more chance of getting something for 25.
So up next then we got the Qatar Grand Prix that's coming this weekend, and you have to go all the way back to 2021 for the last time we raced there, where Lewis Hamilton, remember him, finished in P1, Verstappen this time in P2, and Fernando Alonso then racing for Alpine, taking the last place on the podium in P3. We know that Verstappen is going to be in and around that first place. Could we see Alonso and Hamilton return to their places or thereabouts?
I mean, Mercedes was strong last time for sure. Hamilton stuck it on pole by 0.6 of a second in the race 2 years ago. Very different times, admittedly. But I don't know. I reckon that there's a fair chance of Mercedes doing quite well. It's quite a fast circuit from memory, isn't it? It's still they're at the same circuit, the Losail circuit. There was a possible plan to go to a purpose-built street circuit, that lovely phrase, in the capital, Doha, but they got this sort of shape. The shape of the track, it looks a bit like one of those nice leaves you find on the ground in autumn, with lots of sort of jagged curves. Really random comparison.
The Canada track.
Yeah,
just a maple leaf.
Yeah, but
it's so daft.
But it's got some really fast corners, like 16 corners. It's got some lovely speedy sections. I think that's because I'm pretty sure it's used for MotoGP for the motorbikes.
Yeah.
So I don't think they don't have as many tight corners in that series. You don't get chicanes like you would in Formula 1 necessarily. So it's quite a flowing, nice track. That suggests to me that, well, Red Bull are going to do well, obviously. But it suggests to me as well that I think McLaren, again, are going to be up there. We may see a very similar pecking order to Suzuka, if I'm honest, because similar track in terms of what corners you get, obviously completely different setting and like gradient in terms of how hilly it is, because Qatar is very flat in terms of the track. But I think you might see a similar pecking order. I think McLaren will be competitive. Mercedes might be there and thereabouts, possibly. Ferrari, I'm just naming every single team now. Ferrari possibly with a little mini resurgence. Will Mercedes be as good as they were here a few years ago? I doubt it. Let's be honest. We'll get onto it later, but it's all about the championship, isn't it? And Verstappen, whether he or when he will wrap up the championship. I reckon we should do a prediction for that at some point, because my prediction will be that Sergio Perez will absolutely dump it in the wall and that Verstappen will win the championship by default, like last year when he won it in strange circumstances. But in terms of the track, yeah, nice track. Did it produce much overtaking last time? Can we remember? I feel like it was a little bit.
Not a huge amount.
It's difficult because it's because it's a MotoGP track. It's narrow.
Yes, and it's fast as well, and it's a night race. That's right, is it? It's a night race.
Yeah.
So that's something that's quite nice, I suppose. Really selling it. Really
selling. I mean, these tracks are hard, aren't they?
Yeah.
These desert tracks, because they are all very similar, kind of flat, fast. Burn the oil that we make. Brilliant. What I would say is there is going to be a little bit of an advantage this year over last year, which is with the new regulations, cars can actually follow each other. And so with the fast flowing sections of the track, Angus, which you highlighted, last year, you would be in the person in front of you dirty air and you would be starting to slide around a bit. So hopefully they will be able to take advantage of the car in front, maybe, getting a poor entrance into the beginning of the the flowing section that compromises your whole sector, and now if you can follow properly, then you can take advantage of that. And that's something that we didn't really get last time that around, even if the person in front of you was making a couple of mistakes, because you yourself are compromising your aerodynamic grip and downforce, then you can't get past because it's narrow track. So I'm hoping that we won't have to rely on the long straight as we often have to at some of these tracks, and it will be a bit more interesting. I mean, in terms of the car as well, it's a sort of medium to high downforce, and so I'm expecting McLaren, actually, weirdly enough, to do quite well. They did quite well at other tracks like Zandvoort, and I'm expecting them to do quite well here as well. As a result, the fight really is hotting up between McLaren and Aston Martin, and so this could be yet another opportunity to McLaren to get some really big points and close up that gap to Aston Martin. So yeah, all around, I'm expecting it to be better than last year. I watched the highlights last year. You don't have to. Nothing happens apart from Alonso's podium and Bottas kind of getting a punch in, as Bottas did a lot last time we were there in 2021. Bottas had a terrible year. But I'm hoping that new regulations means that the following will be better and the track will be more open to a better race. Yeah. So all in all, I would expect this to be a average race in terms of excitement, unless something like weird happens, crashes or something like that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think really for the sake of Mercedes, to make sure they have, let's say, a better season than last season in terms of not only the constructors but where they finish in various races as well. I do think they need to be knocking on the door of podiums, indeed getting them, because looking at their last few results, taking away Singapore, it's been fairly lackluster in general. There's been the occasional third, one in Singapore as mentioned, at Silverstone as well, Canada, and then you had that amazing sort of double podium in Spain. But aside from that, it's been a fairly meh year, I'd say, for Mercedes. I think that Hamilton's done very well. He's perhaps gone about his business quieter than normal and done extremely well, better than Russell after not doing so the season before. But I think as a team, as a conglomerate, looking at how they performed last time out in Suzuka, for example, not only the performance but the dynamics as well, it didn't really reek of a team that's in a good place. And say what you will about a team like Aston Martin, Ferrari, and the boom and bust they can have, at least you know with them that when it comes to certain races, they're there to win. They're there to get much higher up. And that's not saying Mercedes aren't, but they don't look like they're able to do that in really any circuits at all. So I think they need to go and put down a marker and go and show everybody that they haven't disappeared and that they're here for next season, indeed here for the last quartile or so, to go and get some serious points.
I think they are improving, and I would suspect as we move into next year, Mercedes are going to be able to develop their car forward and certainly go down the route of the Red Bull style car. I kind of don't think that they're going to get there this year. And whilst they could get a couple of podiums, let's not forget that they've had the position of having two of their drivers on the podium this year. It's not bad going. So, but I would say that at the moment, because it's kind of tight between everyone other than Red Bull, that it's not necessarily a reflection on the fact that Mercedes isn't, great. It could also be a reflection on the fact that their other teams around them are also equally good. So it could also be a symptom, if I'm being nice, of the fact that second, third, and fourth are all fighting for podiums, and that's good racing. Unfortunately, however, the group that are in first, i.e. Red Bull Racing and Max Verstappen, have been in a complete league of their own, and it's almost a dead certainty. It's come on, let's face it. It's a certainty, I think, that Max Verstappen is going to take the World Drivers' Championship this weekend. He needs a grand total of 3 points. That's not 3 points more than Perez. That's just 3 points. All he needs. So I have a funny feeling that the world champion is going to be mathematically crowned, I guess is what we can say about that, in a sprint race. Which I don't know how I feel about that. I feel like that's going to be, yet again, a weird thing that's happened to Max Verstappen. Last time around, it was the whole, is he world champion? We don't really know. Max, you're world champion. And he was like, great, thanks, I'm world champion, and I'll go sit in a big chair in a room of my own in Japan. And this time, it's going to be the end of the sprint race. And they're going to be like, well, that's it then. You're world champion. I guess you don't need to do the Grand Prix anymore. Imagine if he just left. After that, he's like, well, I don't need to do any others. So yeah, I'm absolutely astounded that we're going to be in this position. But yeah, there you go. So that's something to look out for this weekend. Another prediction, I think. I'm willing to bet that Max Verstappen becomes World Drivers' Champion this weekend.
Whoa, don't stretch yourself.
Steady on now.
It's going to be after a year last year where he won it. It's weird. His first championship he won on the last lap of the year, but his second championship he won with 4 races to spare, and he's likely going to win this championship with 5 races to spare. So he's making a habit of wrapping things up nice and early and being dominant. Also, you're right. It's just there's just an inevitability about it. There is nothing really which is going to stop him from winning the championship. Well, there is something that can stop him, which is like his car breaking down, but that's not going to happen. And he's set fair for, once again, more glory. I guess subplot will be interesting to see how the sprint does in Qatar, whether that livens things up a bit. It'll be interesting to see that. But yeah, it's likely that Max Verstappen will join a list of 11 people, or 10 people who have won 3 world championships. So he's going from being in exclusive lists to very exclusive lists. Not to add also the fact that if he wins each of the last 6 races, he will finish the year with the 3rd most Formula 1 wins of all time. He would have overtaken not only Alain Prost but Sebastian Vettel. Okay, imagine that. Imagine telling you a couple of years ago that Max Verstappen would have more career wins than Sebastian Vettel by the end of 2023. You wouldn't have believed me, but here we are. It's very much a distinct possibility.
And there we go, that seems that's all we got time for, and turn to episode 31 of F1 in Review 2023. Thank you very much for listening on your preferred podcast provider, or indeed elsewhere, wherever you get this episode of F1 in Review. A reminder, you can follow us on Twitter, X and TikTok, the handle being F1 in Review, where we post full episodes and then shorter bites of ones that came before. So if you're wondering what we thought about various Grand Prix, like the Japanese one for example, just scroll back and you can go and find what we thought about those or the big topics of them. So as we mentioned many times in this episode, the Qatar Grand Prix is up next. It's a longer Form 1 if you will. We've got qualifying at 6 PM on the Friday. It's a sprint weekend as well. So in terms of Saturday, you've got the shootout at 2 o'clock and then the sprint race itself at 6:30. That all being UK times PM if you're listening, watching, indeed observing any of that. And then finally, last but not least, the race is on Sunday. That being once again 6 PM UK time. So thank you very much for listening, and we will be back next week to go and discuss all of the details and fallout of this and other news coming from Formula 1. Thank you very much, and we'll see you later. Bye bye.